The Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party were thought of as two significant events that sparked revolution in the United States, casting an impact that affects our country to this day. While the majority believe that these events were the reason behind the American Revolution, the reality is that the conflict behind these events changed the course of American history.
It's 1763. Britain was just involved in a very tolling war, the 7 Years' War with France. Britain was in major debt, and the British people refused to pay any more taxes. The Prime Minister at the time, George Grenville, came up with a plan to get the British government out of debt and not tax the people of the British mainland. He proposed the idea of taxing the American colonies. In his opinion, the American people benefited from the war, and if the British were to continue protecting the colonies, the American people would have to pay.
In America, before 1763, Britain was not involved in the day-to-day lives of American people. When Britain began to enforce taxation upon the American people, they were appalled. How could a people who claim to be the authority over our land demand our money when they do not ask people who represent us? The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was the attitude that many of the American people expressed.
What taxes were so brutal that the American colonies were overtaken by such uproar? There were a few taxes the British Parliament passed from 1763 to 1765, but none of these compared to the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act made it mandatory for all official documents to be stamped with an official seal, and the colonists were taxed on those stamps. This act was later repealed in 1766 because of the uproar it caused in the colonies. Another act passed around this time was the Quartering Act of 1765. This act made it mandatory for colonists to house and feed British troops whenever needed. This act was later repealed in 1770 after major conflicts that spurred due to its implementation. Even though these acts did not spark major rebellion, it still sparked anger within the colonists.
If these were not what sparked rebellion within the colonists, then what could have truly caused so much anger that the colonists would passionately protest in the streets? A furious mob. While back in British Parliament, revenue was needed, and the British people still refused to pay taxes. The time is now 1767. The British Treasurer at the time, Charles Townshend, proposed a series of new taxes to implement in the colonies. These included taxes on lead, paint, oil, paper, glass, tea, and other staples. This angered the colonists, and they began to take to the street. At the same time, British troop presence increased in the colonies to help enforce the acts put in place by the Parliament. The colonists were very angry, but nothing compared to what happened on March 5th, 1770.
It was March 5th, 1770. Bottled-up fury infiltrated the air of Boston, Massachusetts, manifesting itself on the streets of this one eventful night. For the past 3 years, the colonists were forced into paying taxes on staples. That night, a British guard stood vigilantly. The mob of colonists approached, taunting and berating him. Suddenly, 8 British soldiers came out and stood by the guard. The colonists increased with aggression, hurling rocks and snow at the soldiers. Then, what the soldiers did next changed America forever. Confusion drove the soldiers to fire shots into the mob without permission. 3 colonists dropped dead, and 2 later died from their injuries. Word spread, especially through images passed on by patriot Paul Revere, who depicted the gruesome scene. Now, the colonists understood the drastic measures the British would take to impose their authority over the colonies in order to keep them in line.
The British Parliament did not take this incident seriously. Instead, they undermined its impact, naming it the incident on King Street, whereas the colonists saw the reality as a bloody massacre. In response to this backlash, all taxes under the Townshend Acts were repealed. In 1773, the Parliament passed the Tea Act, which included a tax on tea. However, little did the British know that this act would facilitate another incident.
It was December 19th, 1773 in Boston, Massachusetts. Once again, the colonists were forced to pay a tax for their tea. Patience rapidly dissipated. In addition, the presence of British troops increased. In response, a group of colonists who called themselves the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Indians and boarded 3 British ships within the Boston harbor. The driving forces of rebellion compelled them to dump 45 tons of tea into the depths of the Boston harbor.
The British Parliament was furious. In the following years, the British would put in place a series of taxes and policies to force their hand over the American people. But the Americans would not rest easy. As Britain continuously tried to enforce more policies, the Americans continued to gain supporters in the cause of independence. The Boston Massacre and Tea Party allowed for the colonies to declare independence. But by looking to the right of taxation, we see the long conflict behind these two events that changed the course of American history.